Hi, A Push. Congratulations again. You made it through period one. One period down, 9 periods left to go. Some of you, especially you, 3 a.m., are going, oh my gosh, the first one was just so horrible. I don't know how I can stand 8 more periods of this. But on the other hand, probably a few of you are going, but wait, that was like 3 lessons. And so if you multiply that out, does that mean that we only have 27 days or 27 lessons yet? Don't get too excited, 3 a.m. No, because if you remember, um, the first period only accounts for about 5% of the material on the AP test. One of the things you're going to find in this course is that there is a friction between teaching you history and teaching you what you need to know for the AP test. Sometimes, those two objectives mesh pretty well, right? But sometimes they don't. And this early period, period one, is kind of an example of that because I would love to spend tons of time um, going into a little bit more detail. One of the things that's kind of surprising is that even in an AP class, there's always more depth you can give, but we had to get through a couple hundred years of history just in a few days. From this point on, the pace is going to be a little bit more relaxed. But if you are wondering why we were skipping around a whole heck of a lot during the first 3 lessons, it's because realistically, that's only about 5% of the test. And if you actually break it down, that means that you're really only going to see that first unit in the multiple choice section or the short answer question section. All right, so now we move on from period two. In period one, we were talking about 3 worlds colliding, but we were especially talking about the emergence of a European superpower, the emergence of Spain. And remember that Spain not only conquers the Aztec Empire, they also conquer the Incan Empire. Actually, from 1492 to 1607, the Spanish crown secures more land and territory than the Roman Empire does in their entire history. Um, Spain wasn't just a European great power, it had become a global superpower. And of course, we know that because of all the gold they were discovering, ultimately that would lead to massive inflation and kind of derail their economy. But other European powers weren't thinking about that or observing that. From their perspective, Spain was practically invincible. So we go from that to this really remarkable and kind of surprising story. Period two, which spans from 1607 to 1754. And one of the things you kind of see is that most of the periods in this course, they don't really have names or titles, but very often I'll try to give you kind of some themes or almost ways to kind of label these periods before we dive into a lot of depth. And if really period two has any story to it or story arc, it's the rise of British North America. And that should be obvious, right? Because, spoiler, starting in 1775 and 1776, we Americans are fighting the British for independence. So that really shouldn't come as a surprise to very many people. But the fact that Britain not only manages to catch up to stronger European powers, but surpass them, is one of the great rags to riches stories in history. In fact, really before, let's say, the 1500s, if there was anything Britain was known for, it wasn't a globe spanning empire, it wasn't industry or high technology, it was sheep. That's really what put Britain on the map, the wool trade. But to kind of play this theme out, I want to actually use this as an example of how to answer some questions that you might see on the AP test. So let's look at period two as a springboard for something super exciting, a chance to go over the types of questions you will see on the AP exam. I can hear the excitement. It's palpable. So you might get a prompt very similar to this. Explain the causes for England's/Great Britain's emergence as a major colonial empire circa, C, by the way, is short for circa. By the way, that's kind of like academic speech for about or ish. Think of circa as ish. Circa 1607 to 1763. Now, let's go over a few points about this question. On the AP exam, you will, I can almost guarantee you, run into a question on causality. You might run into a question on causality in the multiple choice, in the short answer question. I mean, causality type questions are very, very common and popular. But it doesn't have to be, a question on causality in the essays. Sometimes in these essays, they ask you to explain the effects of something. They ask you to provide historical context for an event. So in other words, questions can kind of run the gamut. And by the AP exam, you'll kind of be comfortable with the types of questions that you can be asked. I mean, there's a wide variety, but there does seem to be some patterns and consistencies. And in general, on the essays, they tend to ask you about really broad periods of time. I mean, just look at this, 1607 to 1763. That's over 150 years. So in other words, for some of you, that might be intimidating, right? That you're going, I really have to know 150 years worth of stuff? I mean, it'd be nice, but no, not necessarily. It means that they're giving you a pretty big playground to play on. And so one thing to also keep in mind on the essays is that sometimes the essays are steering you in a specific direction. But they're not really going to, let's say, reduce the number of points you get for not saying something. So in other words, if you come up with a really interesting or clever argument that they're not anticipating, but it happens to work, they should give you full credit. It kind of depends upon your reader. It kind of depends upon how cranky they are, whether they've stubbed their toe in the morning. But in other words, don't think that you necessarily have to know everything that happens between 1607 to 1763. I mean, that's impossible. But other point is, let's take a look. Actually, it's more of a historical point. So this kind of looks gross because of the slash mark there. So just know going forward that when I use the term or the word England or Great Britain, I sometimes use them interchangeably. I really shouldn't, but just for clarification, England is part of Great Britain, but Great Britain is not technically a thing until 1707, okay? So what happens is that in the year 1707, England, Wales, and Scotland come together in what's called the Act of Union, and they form the United Kingdom of Great Britain. That being said, the United Kingdom of Great Britain is kind of a mouthful. So sometimes I'll say Great Britain, sometimes I'll say Britain. Occasionally I will refer to the British as England or the English. And again, sometimes I'm not as precise with that terminology as I would like to be, but just kind of know that if that comes up, just use them interchangeably. Now, let's get to the question, or at least the prompt. So we're not going to go over an entire essay at this point. Really, we're just going to go over the first paragraph, because in your essay, the first paragraph is the single most important thing you can write. Partially that's because it gives your reader a first impression of what you're capable of and how much you know. So a strong first paragraph will kind of buy you some leeway and leniency later on. Because I mean, I'll just be honest. Even as a reader, as somebody who grades this, I tend to focus more on the first paragraph, and if I see some very significant mistakes, that means that, let's say, the reader kind of has an uphill battle to demonstrate that they know what they're talking about. But if I see a mistake at the very end, I'm not, on a subconscious level, I'm not going to penalize that as harshly. And that's because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, maybe they were running out of time and they just wanted to wrap things up as quickly as they can. Or what I'm thinking is, man, they made such a good point in their first paragraph. It was kind of like, if God wrote an essay, this is what it would look like. So I can't find any fault with a minor mistake. But if you make it at the very beginning, let's just say that it's a little bit more difficult to kind of demonstrate that you're a good historian and a good historical writer. So let's go over what is in every first paragraph for a long essay question or a document-based question. So in every essay, whether it's the LEQ or the DBQ, you want to provide historical context. In other words, you take a look at the time period and the location the time period is kind of referring to, and you kind of have to give an idea of what the setting is like. So maybe in that case, you want to talk a little bit about what Britain's colonial empire kind of looks like in 1607, and maybe you want to do kind of like a comparison to what it looks like in 1763. There's no, let's say, context is going to depend upon how you answer the question, but it's kind of like, again, setting the stage, setting the scene for your question or for your answer. Thesis. For right now, let's just say that your thesis is basically your essay's central argument. I'm not going to go into too much detail there because I think that sometimes with this, it's just better to show you rather than tell you about it. But finally, and this might seem a little unintuitive, the twist. For reasons you'll learn a little bit later in painful detail. In both the DBQ and the LEQ, you get an extra point for kind of providing a twist to your argument. You're not necessarily arguing against your main point, but you're giving your reader something else to think about. And College Board is very frustrating, at least on this point, because let's just say that they've been very unclear about what that twist looks like or what it can look like. But I'll kind of give you some ideas here. So go ahead and pause this right now and look over it, and then we'll sort of talk about it. So, context. So, by the way, don't tell Miss Peterson about this boo-boo right here. And by the way, if you're that person who's going, what boo-boo? Forget I said anything. By the way, I don't usually say that. So enjoy it this one time. So your opening paragraph is going to have these three elements: context, thesis, and twist. And on the actual AP exam, you're not going to, or actually when, not just on the AP exam, but when you actually write out sample essays or practice essays, you're not going to kind of label it like this. I mean, this is all going to be one organic paragraph, but I did want to kind of divide it up so you can kind of see what part is what, because these essays, to be honest, they're great American essays. And I don't just mean that because this is U.S. history, but some of you guys are, hopefully most of you guys are familiar with Henry Ford, the assembly line, and basically the idea is that you can kind of take a series of standardized parts, put them together, and manufacture a car. These are assembly line essays. If you kind of know exactly what the rubric is asking you for, and you will by the end of this course, you kind of realize that you can sort of divide the essay into separate blocks and piece them together as you go. So the first block is context. Usually, I would say that, and by the way, keep in mind that I actually had to kind of reduce this in length a little bit so that you could, meaningfully read it on a single PowerPoint slide. But I always get the question, how much context do I need to put in? And the answer is as much as you need, which is very frustrating. But I would say that you need 1 to 2 sentences of solid context. Hopefully a little bit more, because one thing to kind of keep in mind is that your reader isn't going to count off points for doing more than you have to, but they will reduce points if you, let's say, go under the bare minimum. So I would err on the side of caution and maybe spend 2 to 3 sentences, as long as it's relevant. If you're just making stuff up, I mean, that's obviously not going to help you. But give 1 to 2 sentences of solid context here. So basically, the context is Britain enters the race for colonies late, and it sucks. It sucks at colonizing, which is true, by the way. More on that later. But the thesis is that in that suckage comes strength. Because of the fact that Britain is late to the party to a certain extent, and that Britain has a very different style of colonization than its European rivals, its bumbling and buffoonish attempts actually ends up working out for it, because of the fact, basically, that Britain had this habit of setting up colonies in North America and then sort of forgetting about them and letting them run themselves. It means that these colonies become very, very efficient, whereas other European colonies, like, for example, Spain's colonies, were, let's say, sort of micromanaged to a certain extent from the mother country. The same cannot be said for Britain's colonies. And so this mismanagement and negligence, hence, by the way, the phrase salutary neglect, actually becomes a source of long-term strength for the colonies. So they become politically, economically, and socially independent. And by the way, in every thesis, as much as you can, you should have a sentence like this, where you're, by the way, in case you don't know, what this sentence is giving the reader is a roadmap. What this tells your reader is that here's the argument that I'm going to prove. And to prove it, I'm going to talk about how the colonies were politically independent, how they were economically independent, and how they were socially independent. By the way, be sure to do that if you're going to, include a sentence like that. But this will make your reader happy, because so much of the time, when I'm grading these, I get down to the middle and I'm like, where am I? Where are they? What are they talking about, really? And then I go to the first paragraph and I don't see a sentence like this. So I don't know how your paragraphs actually connect with your thesis at all. And that's also kind of a problem, because one of the other things that you have to do in these essays is not just create a thesis, but to support your thesis throughout your essay. And so if I have no idea where you are, it's also hard for me to determine whether or not you're supporting your thesis. So this is kind of a general, I would give this thesis maybe a B minus, I suppose. It's got all the elements. I would actually say that you'll want a little bit more detail here. So how were they politically independent? Maybe throw in a few adjectives there, or rephrase that, so I kind of know with a little more specificity where you're going. So, for example, instead of saying they became politically independent, that's easy to misinterpret, right? Because there's a few of you, maybe you 3 a.m., maybe me if I were back in high school, maybe you're going, well, I thought I learned that America becomes independent in 1776 and you're telling me that it wasn't, and then your mind explodes. And I don't want that. Your reader doesn't want that. So maybe what would help is that when you're talking about political independence, you kind of talk a little bit about what that is. Salutary neglect meant that colonial legislatures had to form, where you're not saying that, let's say America becomes independent overnight, but that you see local government on the small scale. And so that gives the reader an even better idea of where you're going and kind of helps solidify that first impression. All right, the twist. By the way, for those of you who had taken AP World or AP Euro, this is the nuance point. This is the big kahuna. The Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Sasquatch. This is kind of this mythical creature that everybody is trying to catch. And it's hard to catch because College Board is very evasive on what it actually means. Basically, the nuance point requires you to kind of put a twist in your essay to a certain extent, which kind of feels a little unintuitive because when you're in English paper land, and you are writing a persuasive essay, you're just concerned with advancing your side, right? Maybe you talk about the other side's point, but usually it's in the context of saying, man, that is a really dumb point. You are wrong for reasons X, Y, and Z. In AP history, that's not exactly the way it works. Basically, the idea of the nuance point is to give your reader something that makes them go, didn't think about that. And this is kind of why the nuance point is so frustrating. We'll talk about ways of doing it throughout this course. And so if you don't get it right away, that is totally fine. But one way to kind of do it is think of the twist is almost like saying yes, but, or on the other hand, which seems really unintuitive, but for right now, just get in the habit of doing it. So Britain's policy of salutary neglect meant that colonies became politically, economically, and socially independent. However, here's that yes, but, the roots of that very success, military, economic, and cultural supremacy, would eventually result in American independence in 1776. So you're saying, here's why Britain was successful, right? But at the same time, here is this this related development that kind of undermines that success to a certain extent. And to be honest, again, this seems really unintuitive because it is kind of undermining your own side. But remember that your goal isn't necessarily to necessarily prove your case. It is a little bit, but it's also to make your reader think. And so if I see that as a reader, I'm really happy. I'm also really interested. And remember, an interested reader is a happy reader, and a happy reader is more likely than not going to give you extra points. So that is your first paragraph. And for the LEQ, by the way, that's basically 3 out of your 6 points, like almost half of your total points come from your very first paragraph, which is why we spend a little bit of time on it. So that's what it looks like for the LEQ. Let's see what it looks like on the DBQ. Wait, this looks really familiar. Oh, I wonder why. Maybe because they're looking for the exact same things. So when you get into the guts of your essay, when you get to the body paragraphs, you are going to see some changes between the LEQ and the DBQ. Don't worry about those right now, but just know that there will be some changes. But that first paragraph is going to basically be the same. You have to put in context, you have to provide thesis, and then you also have to put in a twist. So, in other words, you already get a sense of how to do really one of the most challenging things you'll do in this class, which is how to write a historical essay. So, by the way, the reason why I go ahead and lay out this argument, or this prompt on the rise of British North America, is that what I'm going to try to do is, not only have I kind of given you an idea of what the argument is, I'm also going to prove it to you over the next little bit. And it's not going to be something that I prove next week necessarily, but by the end of this period, once we get to this little thing known as the French and Indian War, hopefully, if I've done my job, you'll see why I'm making the argument that I do. So, let's talk about the rise of British North America. So, let's talk a little bit more about the rise of British North America. So if you look at England from really 1453 until the early 1600s, England was kind of like the kid that sits in the back row and sleeps through class. Wake up 3 a.m. Also wake up me. Anyway, England is kind of lagging behind the rest of Europe. Its government is very decentralized, and its military and economy kind of pales in comparison to countries like France or Spain. In some respects, it should be really interested in colonization because England is situated on an island, right? The English have been seafaring people only since the Norman conquest in 1066. So it's kind of surprising that nations that don't have as much of a tradition as maritime explorers, like the French or the Spanish to a certain extent, it's those countries that are interested in overseas exploration and colonization, not necessarily the English. But part of that is because the French and the Spanish have strong centralized governments to support overseas expeditions, and the English don't. The English monarchy especially becomes a little less powerful during this time period. That's a little bit more English history than you really need, but just go ahead and kind of remember that. The English, for example, just don't have the same powers to tax and raise armies and raise expeditions the way the French and the Spanish do. Also, if you remember, one of the essential ingredients for overseas colonization is that life is crappy, right? Or at least life could theoretically be better elsewhere. So for the English, one of the things that kind of happens is that during the bubonic plague, especially when the plague kind of peaks in the middle of the 1300s, you have a lot of crappiness concentrated in a few years. But what happens is that after the plague kind of ends and dissipates, the population of England is reduced from anywhere from a third to half, which is obviously horrible to think of. But think about if you're one of the survivors. On the one hand, you've gone through a lot of trauma, but at the same time, you can console yourself with the fact that though you miss dear Uncle Albert, you also inherit dear Uncle Albert's castle, right? Maybe you were kind of a lower class person, or let's say part of the small landowning peasantry, but maybe you have inherited enough land that you could kind of climb up the social ladder. So, in other words, if you're a survivor and life is pretty good, why leave? And so, basically, that's kind of the way things stayed. But think about this: that it's really only in the 15 and 1600s that the population of Europe began surpassing where it was in the 1300s, which is horrible to think of. The fact that it takes that long to actually recover Europe's population in the Middle Ages. But it creates a whole host of new problems. So, for example, in um, England especially. So for cities like London, there starts to be this growing population of urban poor who are unemployed. They don't own land, and let's just say that the authorities were not very kind to them during this time period. Some of the let's say the people who championed overseas exploration did so because it could potentially find places for, quote, human refuse to settle. It's a very British expression. Maybe I should say it with the accent. Human refuse. Human refuse. Basically, worthless people, right? People who are disposable, expendable. Um, so that's point one, that there's this sense in the early 1600s that England is becoming very, very crowded. So that's point one. Point two is the fact that you have young, energetic um, members of the nobility who are reading about what the Spanish accomplished in their conquest of Mexico and the Incan Empire, and they go, well, if they can do that, I can do that too. So, um, what you have is you have people like Martin Frobisher and Sir Walter Raleigh who start to lobby Queen Elizabeth at first for her blessing to provide money for an overseas, let's say more like an overseas exploration mission. Now, what this looks like in the case of Martin Frobisher is Martin Frobisher actually argues that the mythical Northwest Passage to Asia exists. The problem is that most of these overseas explorational missions have been focusing on, the Caribbean, the east coast of what will become the United States. But Frobisher believes that if you go far enough north, you can basically move around North America. Problem is that geographically that's impossible, but he tries nonetheless. What actually happens, though, is that Frobisher, not wanting to return home empty-handed, sets up a colony. Or really, you can't even call it a colony, more like a mining outpost in Frobisher Bay, which is basically right outside of, between the Hudson Bay and Greenland, where basically he tasks everybody involved with this expedition to find sources of gold. Now, what happens is that Frobisher finds a ton of stuff, and he begins loading entire ships full of stuff to take back to England. And lo and behold, what happens is that once these English ships return, they get people to kind of assess what Frobisher has actually found, and it turns out to be pyrite, which is basically fool's gold. So, I mean, just imagine this: an entire expedition is wasted digging up truly worthless, worthless rock. So you have, one of the things that kind of happens with these colonial, or especially these earlier colonial expeditions, is that they tend to be epically successful or epic failures. And speaking of epic failures, let's talk a little bit about Sir Walter Raleigh, somebody who should be near and dear to our hearts because, spoiler, have you guys ever heard of Raleigh, North Carolina? Well, Walter Raleigh is, how best to describe Walter Raleigh? Walter Raleigh is kind of like an Elizabethan era Elon Musk. For those of you who don't know who Elon Musk is, somebody who is very entrepreneurial, very energetic, thinks he knows everything, and in most cases probably does know more than anybody else. I mean, he's a fairly bright guy. And Walter Raleigh is also very aware of the fact that these Spanish treasure ships are moving back and forth between Spain and their colonies in the Americas. And so what happens is that, England actually becomes a Protestant country. because of the English Reformation in the early 1500s. And Spain is kind of like the unofficial mascot of Catholic Europe. And England and Spain basically go through 2 centuries of near constant warfare over this. And even when they're not actively fighting against each other, there's still these simmering tensions. Okay, so what also happens though is that there is this weird sense that England and Spain have to be nice and get along if they're at peace in Europe. But if you go to the colonies, well, just because England and Spain are at peace doesn't mean that English and Spanish colonists have to be at peace with one another. There's this whole idea that once you go beyond this imaginary line in the north, in basically the Atlantic, then everything goes. It's kind of like Outback Steakhouse, except there are rules in Outback Steakhouse. There aren't rules in the colonies, and that attracted a lot of people, especially guys like Sir Walter Raleigh here. So Sir Walter Raleigh pitches the idea of setting up basically an outpost off the coast of North Carolina to raid Spanish shipping. And we talked a little bit about that beforehand. It's the Lost Colony at Roanoke. Now, we actually have a pretty good idea of what happened there. So the fact that Roanoke is a lost colony and then people act surprised at what happened is kind of ridiculous because Raleigh organizes this expedition and he basically delegates an Englishman by the name of John White as the first governor of the colony. John White and the rest of the colonists, they don't really focus on, reasonable things like providing food for themselves. Instead, they're just going to go and try to find gold, and they'll just mooch off the Native Americans for food and all their basic necessities. And then, lo and behold, they're surprised when Native Americans in the area take issue with that. So, what happens is that John White, frustrated that the local Native Americans aren't, bending over backwards to feed his colony, he returns to England in around the year 1585 to request additional supplies. The problem is, as some of you know, that's the same year that King Philip II of Spain launches the Spanish Armada in an attempt to invade England. And so at that point, England is cut off from its new colony in North Carolina. Fortunately for the English, England is saved because of a surprised hurricane, and basically the entire Spanish Armada is blown almost entirely across the Atlantic. But what happens is that delays John White's return to Roanoke, and when he actually makes it back to Roanoke, the colony has vanished. He finds the word Croatan basically carved into a tree, and that is the only indication of where let's say the fate of the lost colony. Now, what's interesting is that in prior years I assigned a book called The American Colonies by Alan Taylor for a summer reading assignment. You can thank COVID for the fact that you didn't have to do that this year. But in Taylor's book, Taylor talks about the likely fate of the lost colonist. What Taylor says is that most of the colonists were killed by an overwhelming Native American attack. But even though the colonists were mostly killed, they weren't all wiped out. Because one of the things that Native Americans kind of prioritized whenever they were fighting anybody, including themselves, is taking captives. And very often these captives would be integrated into their society. And apparently, according to Taylor, there were a few survivors of the lost colony, and they made their way north. And apparently, once they arrived around the area of the Chesapeake, they were discovered by a very powerful Algonquin Sachem. That is Sachem, which basically means like a warrior chief. They were found by a very powerful chief by the name of Powhatan, who apparently, upon hearing of the presence of the foreigners, attacked with overwhelming force and wiped them out. Now, Powhatan led a coalition of nearly 20,000 Algonquin Indians in and around the area of what will eventually be called Jamestown. So think about the implications of that. That means that when England settles a colony in Jamestown, it's not as if Powhatan and the Native Americans are shocked or surprised. In fact, Powhatan knows more about the English and the Europeans probably than they know about him. So just keep that in mind. Now, the English are still interested in setting up some kind of outpost in North America. So there is a proposal by a few investors to fund another colonial expedition to Jamestown, or actually what will be Jamestown. So what happens is that the Virginia Company, which is a joint stock company, is established to organize an expedition. Now, it's very important that you understand what a joint stock company is. A joint stock company is a company in which you have multiple investors fund the colony, and then they're going to get some of the profits. Now, the thing is that companies today are basically descendants of these joint stock companies. So if you've ever heard of what's called a board of directors, a company, most publicly traded companies rather, are run by a board of directors. And they're usually composed of members who have invested money in the colony, in the company. And the reason you have this structure is pretty straightforward. Colonies are risky ventures. We saw that with Roanoke. Sometimes they are fantastically successful. Sometimes they are epic failures. And usually, especially in this time period, it's very often one of those two extremes, either epic successes or epic failures. So the thing is that if you decide that you want to go and create a colony of your own, well, that's either going to be the best decision you ever make or the worst decision you ever make. So, do you feel lucky? How confident do you feel that things are going to pan out? So, the joint stock company is a model in which maybe you don't single-handedly fund an entire company, but you get your friends to fund it as well. So it means that if your colony is successful, you're not going to get all the money, but you'll get at least some of it, right? So let's say that you invest 50%. Let's say that you funded the colony 50% or so. That means you're going to get 50% of the profits, for example. So what this means is that you take away a lot of the risk inherent. By the way, not the risk for the colonists, for the people who actually participate. There's still tons of risk there, but you take away the financial risk at the very least. And this is a model that you see in Jamestown, but it's also a model that you see in several different colonies, especially some of England's colonies. It should be pointed out that a lot of Spain's colonies were purely military ventures, where they're not necessarily run by a company, they're basically run by the crown. So there usually is a problem with this model. And the problem is that, again, colonization is very, very dangerous, very risky. So do you think those wealthy investors want to participate in the venture? And the answer is a definite no. You farm it out. You get other people to set up a colony for you, right? That's why you're an investor, not a colonist. So the problem that you're going to see is in these colonies with joint stock companies. So imagine if you need to make a big decision. Um, well, that means that you have to take a ship across the Atlantic. You have to get basically the board, the investors together, and they're going to have to make a decision. And then maybe 6 months later, maybe up to a year later, you'll finally get like a definitive answer, which is not good. So, in other words, these joint stock companies were very effective at funding colonies, but not necessarily running colonies. So, that being said, the king grants what is called a royal charter to the Virginia Company to establish a colony in North America. So this colony, this expedition, decides to establish a stronghold, a colony, along what is called the James River. I wonder if it was called the James River, you know, before colonization. Well, no, it wasn't, by the way. And Jamestown is a new thing as well. So this is and something else you'll kind of see in colonial American history. You see a lot of examples of sucking up to the boss. So King James, the James River, Jamestown. There's a lot of James in this area. By the way, if you want to know where Virginia comes from, it's named for James's predecessor, the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth, not current Queen Elizabeth. So the problem is that they intentionally situate this colony further away from the Spanish Empire. So if you remember, the Spanish have a military outpost in Florida. And the English aren't the only, they're not the only empire trying to create overseas colonies. The French actually tried to establish a colony, for example, in South Carolina. The problem is that Spain, if you remember from the Treaty of Tordesillas, has claimed basically all of North and South America except for Brazil. Now, the fact is that none of the other European powers really take them seriously, but the Spanish decide to do something about it. And the Spanish actually sail from St. Augustine, Florida, and they actually wipe out this French colony in South Carolina. And by the way, they wipe out a colony, not just of Frenchmen, but fellow Catholics. So if the Spanish will do that to fellow Catholics, what will they do to English Protestants? So that's maybe an explanation for why the English kind of situate their colony, let's say, kind of away. They sort of tuck it away along the James River to hide it. So there's some strategic sense there to avoid the Spanish, but the problem is that, if you've ever been to Jamestown, and if you give the opportunity, I encourage you to go, because you're going to get a lot more in 30 seconds than you will from this entire lecture. And that may say something about my storytelling skills. I mean, that's fine. But it has more to do with the fact that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So basically, this is what Jamestown is surrounded by. So you see a lot of swamp water, in effect, which means that Jamestown is completely indefensible. And if that's not bad enough, the water itself is brackish, which means that it's very salty. And so you're in the middle of this swamp surrounded by water, but you can't actually drink any of it. And apparently the original settlers of Jamestown tried to dig wells, and then whenever they actually found a few wells, it was discovered that the water had arsenic. In other words, they were drinking poison water. So that was killing them. And by the way, something else that was also killing them were the mosquitoes. You know, you have lots of water that's not going anywhere. That becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes. So people were catching malaria. And if that's not bad enough, there were Native American attacks. Um, so, and by the way, it was hard for them to actually defend the settlement because again they had built it in low-lying terrain surrounded by swamp water. Now, just for just to give you guys kind of an idea, um, in 1607, about 144 Englishmen actually arrived or set sail for Jamestown. 39 of them died at sea, which wasn't uncommon, by the way. I mean, just imagine that. You've already lost about a third of your population right off the bat. Then they arrived in Jamestown on May 14th, 1607, and almost immediately ran into conflict with the natives. Part of the problem is the fact that most of the original settlers of Jamestown were kind of like, well, in some respects, they were people like Cortez. They were young-ish people from kind of the lower nobility to middle class who were single, ready to mingle, I guess, single, and they wanted to find a way to kind of strike it rich. So you have a bunch of people who are really independent and want to go and do their own thing. So as soon as they arrive, basically all the settlers, focus on finding gold. And just like in Martin Frobisher's expedition, they find a lot of fool's gold, and then they take the fool's gold to England, and they discover that, well, it's not gold, right? So what this all means, though, is that they're so focused on finding gold that they, let's say, miss a few important details, like how are they going to eat? And so in the winter of 1607, they go through this period called the starving time. I'll give you three guesses as to what they did during the starving time. And so during those first few years, we actually have accounts of cannibalism that occurred in Jamestown. So in, let's see, May of 1607, there were approximately 100, actually specifically, there were 105 English settlers. By September, 50 of them had died of disease. And by January of 1608, only 38 remained. So just think about that. Now, what happens is that eventually about 500 more settlers actually arrive in Jamestown. So it kind of reinforces the population a little bit. But then by 1610, only 60 settlers out of 600 remain. So just imagine that. That's a 90% mortality rate there. 9 out of 10 people who go to Jamestown die. And part of it is because of location. It's situated in a terrible place. But also part of it is leadership. The fact is that there's nobody forcing people to stop looking for gold and actually focusing on, growing food for survival. And that's where we will end for the day. So I will see you guys next time where we will talk about Powhatan, Pocahontas, John Smith, and Disney's version of history. See you then.